Good afternoon and welcome to this week's conversation on race and policing. Today we will be joined by Kenneth Alyass from Harvard, working on his doctorate. But before we begin, I would like to read our land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, Yuha Vietnam. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Teixeira.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending, and a special thanks to our guest today, almost Dr. Kenneth Alyass, and we wish him well in his pursuit of his dissertation. But just in point of introduction, Kenneth is a PhD student in history at Harvard University, where he studies race, class, and crime in American cities during the late 20th century. It's almost like he's doing this for us, for this panel, because it's exactly what we're doing. His proposed dissertation project is provisionally titled From the Motor City to the Murder City, Detroit in the Age of Mass Incarceration. It examines how transformations in racial capitalism and emergence of neoliberalism and the modern carceral state shaped urban governance between 1970 and 2000. Thanks to the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences for assisting with putting this special program on. And again, thanks to Ken for agreeing to be with us today. And without further ado, Mr. Alyass.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, George, for the land acknowledgement. It was beautiful and very powerful. I'm glad to hear it. I'm in an institution where not too many land acknowledgements are often said, so I'm really happy to hear that today. Well, thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day to come listen to me speak. Like Mary said, my name is Kenneth. I am currently a PhD student at Harvard University. Before that, I just want to give you a little bit about myself. I grew up and lived in Michigan, where I did my undergraduate degree, starting off at a community college, actually, and then made my way to Wayne State, which is a university much like Cal State at your institution. And then shortly then, I decided to do my PhD in history. So broadly, I'm a historian of the modern United States, basically the 20th century, but I'm also interested in the late 19th century and increasingly the 2000s, our most recent history. And I just want to say, first of all, that I'm really impressed with this speaker series. I was looking through the talks and I was just astounded by the guests that you invited here. And I also want to say how impressive it is that you guys have kept up the speaker series for over 3 years now. And I think that although a lot of people tend to forget, something profoundly historical occurred 3 years ago during the summer of 2020. In the midst of one of our nation's most dramatic crises, people, tens of millions of people, as most of you probably remember, went out into the streets to protest the brutal police murder of George Floyd. But it was not just a protest against the murder of George Floyd. It was a protest against these longer, more powerful structures of oppression that have for a very long time and continue to do so, shape the destinies of millions of Americans. So I just want to say how amazing it is that you guys have this speaker series and how important it is that we keep having these conversations. So during this talk, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to introduce my research interests a little bit, my teaching interests, kind of the four big themes I'm interested in. I'm going to talk about what are the motivating questions of my research. I'm going to discuss a little bit about my dissertation. Mary already told you a little bit about it, but I'm going to mention a bit more. And then I'm going to talk about where paid for by crime, civil asset forfeiture, and the war on drugs, where that fits in and how I'm envisioning this project. I just want to preface this by saying that paid for by crime is not it's not an article length project I'm working on right now. It's more so a collection of different writings and research I've done in the past year or so, sort of my foray into trying to make sense of the legal history of what scholars and historians call the carceral state. So the project is still a bit new. I still don't have all the answers to all the questions that I'm thinking of, and I haven't done all the research. What I'm going to do today actually is introduce the project to you guys with an anecdote and laying out some of the crucial concepts and why I think that this project is important right now. And then I want to spend the rest of the time, hopefully, 30 minutes or so, answering your questions, having a conversation. And I also encourage you too, you can find my email on the link that I think Jeremy posted in the chat or on the event website. If you have any questions about any topic I mentioned, or maybe you're just planning to apply to a PhD, or you're just interested about history, you just want to have a conversation, please feel free to email me. I promise you I will respond within a few days. I'd love to have conversations with you guys and to continue the chats that we're having today. Okay, so I would categorize my four main research and teaching interests within these four categories. So I mentioned earlier that I'm a historian of the modern United States. To that end, I'm really interested in, my specialty is in histories of crime, policing, and punishment in the United States. I think a lot about the relationship between these three distinct yet interrelated categories, and in particular about crime. When I think about crime, I think about the history of criminalization and the expansion of criminal law in the late 20th century, especially as it came to drugs and organized crime, and the way that reshaped the prerogatives of policing and punishment. And to that extent, I emphasize in my research that crime, policing, and punishment are not sort of continuous categories, right? That they're made, broken up, and reshaped over periods of time in response to what's going on in the world. So when I think a lot about crime, policing, and punishment, I'm thinking about it as a contingent category that changes shape over the decades of the 20th century. To that end, I'm also interested in the relationship between social and political movements and the state. Now, that sounds pretty broad. It is. It means a lot of different things. But in particular, and as it relates to my research, what I'm interested in is the law and order movement that began in the late 1960s and really took off in the 70s and the 80s and has since dominated discussions around crime and policing. Law and order kind of became a sort of common sense rhetoric that politicians, policymakers, and wide swath of the general public use in order to justify expansions of the carceral state. But to that end, I'm also interested in anti-carceral struggles, from opposition to the drug war to protests against police brutality. I think a lot about how these movements translate their street power into political power and what the outcomes look like when they're sometimes victorious, which they often are in all sorts of different ways. I'm also interested in illicit and informal economies and culture. And this is something I think is more closely related to paid for by crime than any of the other categories. Particularly drug economies that develop in the wake of deindustrialization and the transformation of global drug trafficking networks. So to that end, I think a lot about how the enormous expansion of the drug economy in the latter half of the 20th century, from crack cocaine to heroin, to marijuana, to all sorts of other drugs, provided new opportunities for previously underemployed inner city residents and reshaped social geography. So when I think about illicit and informal economies and the people that are doing work there, I'm thinking a lot about it as work, as labor, as a business. And I'll get into that a little bit more when I introduce paid for by crime. And then finally, in terms of my geographic focus, where are the spaces that I'm really interested in studying, that I'm applying these other thematic categories to? I'm really interested in studying urban and metropolitan history, in particular urban governance, which is basically how governments in these areas responded to the many crises of this period, and how they responded to these crises in a variety of ways, from policing to social services to everything else that comes in between. So there are three kind of major questions that are driving my research right now, and that have shaped this project that I'm working on, paid for by crime. The first, and I think this is the big shout out to any of the historians who are listening. The first is, how should we think about periodization and the war on crime and the war on drugs? So this this question is really about temporal categories and the kind of idea about a timeline. It's something that historians do pretty much all the time as we do our work. It's one of our most powerful sort of framing mechanism to make sense of historical processes and movements and the actions of actors and ideas and thoughts and all that other stuff that goes into making history. And in particular, I'm really interested in these questions about, the war on crime, the war on drugs. How should we think about them? Because a lot of the things that we discuss that we associate, say, with the 1980s war on drugs, with Ronald Reagan, Just Say No, all these things. If we actually look at these categories and these processes, the ideas, we actually see that they existed, many, many years before. So how should we make sense of periodization? How should we go about kind of, creating a timeline and putting these things together and then trying to make sense of all this history? So when I do my research, and I'm really lucky to be doing research on the war on crime and the war on drugs in this period where in the past decade, there's been an influx of literature on these topics from historians. This is kind of called the carceral turn in historiography. I'm really lucky to have so much of this literature that exists right now because it's telling us quite a bit about the war on crime, the war on drugs, and how maybe we really shouldn't think about, kind of shoving them into these temporal categories of, say, decades or even a couple of decades, and actually think of them as the long war on crime and the long war on drugs. And so what I do in my project, Paid For by Crime, is I think about these pivotal moments, these turning points in these long war on crime and war on drugs that we can point at and say, that's when things started to change. Why did it change? How did it change? What are the factors influencing it? And how did those change then, reshape institutions outside of those particular events? So the second question I think quite a bit about is how did the emergence of what scholars call the modern carceral state reshape the law, institutions, and government? This is kind of a basic question. And when I mean carceral state, I'm kind of talking about institutions of policing and punishment, but also a wide variety of mechanisms, sort of tools that the state uses, but also private entities, basically using it to discipline people, to regulate behavior, to control populations, and to shape the destinies of millions of people. And, importantly too, this occurs in particular geographic areas. So, we often think about it in cities, but also the carceral state exists outside in the countryside where most of the prisons are located. It exists at the level of the county where sheriffs are located. And all that other stuff. So this is one question that I asked myself is that, as criminal law was dramatically expanded in the latter half of the 20th century, how did it reshape the way we perceive governance, the way the government does its business, and as well as the law in the Supreme Court, but also at the local level, and as well as institutions everywhere from businesses and churches to universities. And then finally, one of my favorite questions is how should historians think about scale and jurisdiction when it comes to crime control and incarceration? So for example, local, state, federal, international, multi-jurisdictional. I mentioned county sheriffs earlier, even federal prisons, different between federal prisons, state prisons, local prisons, jails and prisons. This is something that is really important because when we talk about policing in the United States, as I'm sure most of you know and understand, we're talking about a disparate amount of entities. Really, there are tens of thousands of policing agencies in the United States, all the way from your local, down the street police department to the state police and other policing entities within state governments, to the federal government, the FBI, Homeland Security, but as well as international organizations, all of which I mentioned do function multi-jurisdictionally. But also, not just about the jurisdiction of government, but also about university police departments, private police departments, neighborhood, safety associations and whatnot, who do this work of crime control and do the work of discipline. So I think, this is one of the key questions I ask myself all the time is, where is scale in terms of size and how far can these sort of tentacles of power reach in jurisdiction too, legal jurisdiction, but also in interpretations of jurisdiction as well. So those are the kind of, three main questions driving my research as a whole. And like Mary wonderfully mentioned, my dissertation project is titled From the Motor City to the Murder City, Detroit in the Age of Mass Incarceration. which is basically an urban history of Detroit since the 1970s, tracking how the city, once known around the world as the Motor City, turned into the Murder City in a span of 40 years. And the image you see on the screen here is one of my favorite pictures from the period. I think this was 74, 75. In 1974, Detroit elected its first African-American mayor. Much like many other cities around the country, in the 70s was a period of enhanced Black political power, a lot of victories all over the place. And when Coleman Young, who you see that man right there standing next to those police officers on the left, right on the right of the Detroit police words, he came into office on the plan of police reform. And he titled his police reform program Law and Order, with Justice. And a key part of that was turning the Detroit Police Department into what he described as the People's Police Department. So this is one aspect of my research that I think is really critical to the way we understand policing and the way we understand our moment today, right? Because the history of policing really since the 1960s and 1970s has been a history of reform. And that might seem strange to you too, because when we think about policing and the evolution of policing, we kind of think about it as a evolution of militarization and more punitive policing as time goes on, which is true. That is what happens. But in a lot of ways, a lot of what happens in terms of militarization and the expansion of policing was also a process of reform too. That in those moments in the 70s and the 80s that we're experiencing, many of the struggles we're experiencing now, a lot of these movements did win victories, but the reforms implemented and in the aftermath of these victories often did not achieve what they wanted to do, and in many cases ended up making policing more violent and more pervasive. And ultimately, and this is kind of the main sort of idea of my dissertation, I challenge the idea that we have to respond to the problems of crime with policing. And in fact, if we rethink the entire regime of criminalization and ask ourselves, what is crime really when we pull back the layers and try to understand it? Are there better ways to approach it, such as from a public health perspective or a social policy perspective? And those are all questions that I'm constantly thinking about. And I think people today in this nation are really at the forefront of their mind. Okay, so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to introduce the project Paid For by Crime. And after that, I'm going to end it and take the questions you have. So in the late 1980s, in Southwest Detroit, on a cold winter day, Gladys Fajou stood outside on the porch with her luggage at her side as police officers and sheriff deputies made their way inside her family home. The home was empty, devoid of people and belongings. The only thing that remained was a cross on the wall above the basement staircase. A crowd of her neighbors, including Emma Kogo and Jennifer Miracle, who you can see on the slide right here, standing next to her husband, gathered on the snow-crusted front lawn of the Fajou family the Fajou family house next to a throng of reporters. Emma and Jennifer recalled dozens of events with the family, from casual Sunday barbecues to streetwide 4th of July parties. By the mid-1980s, however, relations between them began to sour. After Gladys's father became ill and unable to work, their mother started to sell marijuana out of the house to make ends meet. Soon, the kids, including Gladys, got involved, and their small illegal business grew and began to sell more lucrative drugs such as heroin and crack cocaine. After 7 police raids on the house in 1 year, with several arrests and no sign of stopping, Jennifer Miracle and a group of homeowners from around the street, self-styled as just the neighbors, began to search for a permanent end to what they saw as a danger to their community. To their luck, that year, Detroit Police Department and Wayne County Prosecutor's Office announced a partnership to crack down on alleged crack houses in Detroit through the use of a recently enhanced legal instrument, civil asset forfeiture. Unlike criminal forfeiture in personam, which provides due process rights enshrined in the Constitution, such as the right to a jury trial, right to an attorney, and that charges an individual, civil forfeiture in rem has no such protections and charges the property itself as the guilty party. This type of forfeiture occurs when a law enforcement agency has probable cause to suspect that property, profits, or proceeds have been utilized or acquired in an illegal way. Expanded by the Comprehensive Forfeiture Act of 1984, and this was actually part of a much larger crime bill in that same year, civil asset forfeiture quickly became one of the most utilized weapons to wage the ballooning war on drugs. By the late 1980s, law enforcement agencies of all jurisdictions and sizes accumulated large amounts of money and assets, such as cars, buildings, aircrafts, boats, drugs themselves, lab equipment, jewelry, clothing, and I have found in the archive, even food stamps and welfare checks were forfeited. Every arrest became a potential forfeiture, and claimants of the property, whether they were eventually found guilty or not, rarely challenged civil suits. It was easy money for law enforcement with few court costs because the burden of proof in a civil forfeiture was on the claimant and not the government. In Detroit, the police department and the county prosecutor's offices used a state ordinance, in this case, nuisance abatement, to seize the fugitive house and transfer ownership from the family to the city government. The auction of the house only brought in a few thousands of dollars to the city, all of which went to a special drug forfeiture fund, which was a special bank account created by the police department to house and distribute seized assets and profits. So while the fugitive house did not bring in the big bucks, the many tens of thousands of other forfeitures that occurred in the city in that year and the years following raked in millions of dollars in just a few years. Now on the screen here, you can see this is one of the forfeiture fund budgets that I found in the archives. You kind of look at the various things that they were directing money at. So civil forfeiture became a way for law enforcement to self-finance anti-drug operations in the midst of these macroeconomic struggles. In the 1980s, Detroit, like many other cities, faced austerity at the state and federal level, accompanied by 3 decades of deindustrialization, population flight, and global economic restructure. This plunged the city into a deep fiscal crisis where every budget session became a whack-a-mole game of what service to cut, who to lay off, and how to delay improvements and repairs. But at a time of fiscal belt tightening, critics of the Detroit Police Department called into question the agency's expensive drug war that grew over the course of the decade. To assuage these critics and to find creative ways to self-finance anti-drug policing, Chief William H. Hart, in partnership with the courts and the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, devised a new initiative to raise funds while fighting crime and drugs. Chief Hart declared that instead of having the taxpayers fork over the dollars to pay the department's war on crack, the city's new and expanded drug war would be, quote, financed from funds confiscated from drug dealers. The expansion of federal and state asset forfeiture in this way during the 1990s created what legal scholars Eric Blumenson and Eva Nelson have called a drug war dividend. The dividend is a financial incentive structure built into the logics of anti-drug policing that encourages narcotics officers, prosecutors, and judges to target the property and profits of drug workers and their customers. It made anti-drug policing profitable, and in the quest for more drug loot, more punitive and widespread. At a time when the crack crisis generated a sprawling illicit economy, forfeiture laws provided the legal, technical, and material framework for a dramatic transfer of what historian Jackson Smith has termed dirty capital from the drug economy to elements of the vast carceral state. Forfeiture also provided law enforcement a new way of conceptualizing and policing the drug economy. Every arrest, raid, and entrapment became a potential source of revenue. Each individual held previously unattainable property that was now valuable and forfeitable, such as cash, a vehicle, jewelry, drug paraphernalia, electronics, and most importantly, in terms of the resale value, real property such as buildings and land. And like I mentioned earlier too, every item on someone's property, on someone's body was forfeitable too. So like I mentioned earlier, the welfare checks, money itself, cash, but also personal belongings. So as a result, across the nation between 1980 and 2000, the value of assets seized by law enforcement skyrocketed to several billions of dollars per year. So in effect, law enforcement in Detroit during the late 1980s and early 1990s funded part of its war on crack with funds made by crack. This process reordered the nature of anti-drug policing. The profitability factor came into play into all parts of the criminal justice process, from the first raid and arrest to the final judgment of the court and the transfer of the property to the police or city agency. Scholarship on forfeiture, however, focuses largely on federal agencies or a handful of exceptionally egregious forfeitures against wealthy individuals and corporations. The constitutional scholars and criminologists who produced the literature in the decades after the dramatic expansion of forfeiture were primarily interested in demonstrating the material scope of forfeiture, so how much of it was going on and how was this affecting police departments, its unconstitutionality, primarily the way it violates the Fourth Amendment, but also the way that law enforcement uses civil law as a means of criminalization, and how it perverses the mission of law enforcement by generating a for-profit motive to do police work. But a historical study of the expansion of forfeiture, its uses and abuses during the war on drugs, and in particular, and this is what I'm really interested in this project, how local police agencies used it to transform their own drug wars, has yet to be written, but it has begun to receive attention from historians. So historians continue to focus on the local particularities of crime, criminalization, and criminal justice, asking about the relationship between local police departments and federal agencies. The expansion of forfeiture during the height of the drug war in the mid-1980s stands out as a pivotal moment and turning point in the development of the carceral state. Now, law enforcement can use the civil law system to expand their ability to criminalize, to police, and to seize the assets of drug workers and those around them without having to work through the protections and due process of criminal law, or the criminal law of forced people. So what this project does is it studies the formation and crystallization of drug asset forfeiture in Detroit during the crack crisis, so roughly between 1986 and 1995. And the reason why I'm interested in the crack crisis in particular is the moment where huge amounts of illicit wealth are created and are generated, and police departments notice that, and they employ that to their advantage by focusing on forfeiture as their primary tool within the drug war. So broadly, what I do in this project is I explore how law enforcement in the city use the new forfeiture laws to devise their own forfeiture regime, policies, and programs to acquire illicit wealth produced in the crack trade. In doing so, this project contributes to an emergent body of scholarship in carceral history that urges historians to consider the relationship between political economy and the war on drugs on one hand, and the budgetary and administrative history of local police agencies on the other. The expansion of forfeiture during this period created a new type of policing that combined George Kelling and James Q. Wilson's 1982 broken windows theory with the drug war dividend concept to solidify the process of policing for profit. So in a lot of ways, you probably heard of that term, policing for profit. It's most often associated with fee policing in Ferguson, Mississippi, way back ago. But what I'm arguing here is that forfeiture, in many ways, is actually a very direct sort of profit-motivated policing mechanism in a way where fee policing is not so direct. Forfeiture policy reordered the logics of local anti-drug policing during the crack crisis through the formation of a legal and policy system that laser focused on profits, proceeds, and properties in the struggle to police and contain the drug economy. The tool of forfeiture, or better yet, the weapon of forfeiture, significantly altered the terrain of battle in the 1980s and the 1990s. In doing so, forfeiture has made the war on drugs more violent, drug trafficking more lucrative, and anti-drug policing more profitable for police agencies. And as I mentioned earlier with the case of Gladys Faju, Jennifer Miracle, and Emma Kogo, it also brought community members and police departments closer together as law enforcement developed a community policing infrastructure that helped neighborhood anti-drug and anti-crime groups initiate their own forfeitures and ways of shutting down suspected crack houses. So civil forfeiture is situated at the intersection of multiple convergences of law and order politics, drug control policy, and community policing during the 1980s and 1990s. Its expansion and widespread application introduced a new and important revenue stream for law enforcement during a pivotal period in the nation's decade-long war on drugs. It helped entrench the drug war in the nation's crime and policing policy because it provided a direct incentive for law enforcement to continue to criminalize and police the drug economy. Today, despite efforts at reforms, and I think the last reforms were in 2000 or 2001, and then there's been a series of state-by-state reform efforts, but for the most part today, civil asset forfeiture remains legal. It remains a potent, a profitable, and a penetrating legal and administrative procedure for law enforcement. So as we enter a new period in our nation's long war on drugs, a period that appears like there might be an end or at least a winding down of the punitive drug war that we're so used to in these past few decades, scholars and activists must contend with the fact that the structures that facilitated the war on drugs, such as forfeiture, are still here with us, entrenched within the very logics of modern day policing, shaping our everyday lives and continuing to criminalize and inflict harm and violence upon workers in the drug economy and the communities they do business in. And perhaps the most dramatic thing that forfeiture does is it gives a profit incentive to do the work of policing, which I'm sure you can figure is really pervasive and really just unconstitutional as well as in many ways immoral. So that is paid for by crime. Where I'm at with it right now is that I'm workshopping papers. I'm talking to other scholars. I'm speaking out to criminologists and legal scholars who have done this kind of work before, and I'm trying to understand, what direction I will go in. But that is it for my presentation and talk. I'm really excited to hear what you all have to say about this, and I'm ready to answer the questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kenneth. That was pretty, a lot of food for thought, I think, because I think a lot of us don't know about this phenomenon of asset forfeiture. I guess my first question is, I recall reading about, and I can't cite, but reading about not just those assets being used to fight directly the war on drugs, but they argue indirectly for ski vacations, for mountain cabins. And I'm wondering if you've come across any sort of, information about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so definitely. So by the end of the 90s, actually, and this is kind of the final part of this project that I'm researching, Chief William Hart was actually arrested and convicted and charged. I don't remember who he was convicted or what he was convicted for exactly, but the scandal was that there was $6 million missing from the drug forfeiture fund by, I think it was 1994 and 1995. He was fired, and charged and arrested for it. And it turned out a lot of that money was going to exactly what you mentioned, to people's personal expenditures, whether it be buying cars or taking vacations. And I think the thing with forfeiture about it is that the laws vary from state to state. So in some states, such as I think Washington and Oregon, for example, they have much stricter regulations when it comes to forfeiture, where they actually require something like 80% of all funds that were acquired in a forfeiture to be sent to the state treasury, which will then be used for education or healthcare or something along those lines. In Michigan, those laws were non-existent. So they allowed a lot of leeway for police departments to basically do whatever they want for them. So there is the usage that way in terms of legal usage, but there's also the usage which I've run across, which is basically just using the funds for non-direct police work in the frame of like, using the cars that were forfeited to give them to police officers to use during their police work, or just to like buy couches or all these other sort of non-direct police work properties. So yeah, it's definitely in terms of corruption, is definitely very open and susceptible to corruption.
Right. And we had a very famous case of, I guess maybe decades ago now, about the man who lived in Malibu and was subject to a multi-department police raid and was killed. And his property, there was some belief by certain politicians within Los Angeles County that these trumped up charges about marijuana being grown on his property, and there was none, were just that they were trumped up so that they could seize his property, which was valued at over $5 million. So it is not just cars and houses. I mean, it's very, very valuable assets here. And I'm not sure, the outcome of that case. Nevertheless, it was pretty egregious and covered by the local newspapers quite extensively, because it was just so, I mean, the man heard stuff outside his house at like 4 o'clock in the morning. So he comes out armed and he's killed. So it was really quite tragic. Matt, do we have other questions?
We do have a question. It is, how much of a public issue at the time was civil forfeiture itself rather than corruption? And then second part, was it something Detroiters contested or approved of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's two parts to it. The first part, how much of a public issue was it at the time rather than the corruption? So in terms of it being a public issue, what I found in my research, from sort of residents in the city themselves, there wasn't really that much knowledge about it. The laws weren't really in terms of advertised, they weren't really talked about all that much. It wasn't really until kind of 86, 87 when the city started this project where they tried to involve citizens in the process of anti-drug policing, which I'll mention the second part of what you said. But where it became a public issue in the country as a whole, and kind of the separate project we're working on, is that as it began to be used more and more, as several Supreme Courts came to the court, most of which they just simply approved the process and said that the government has been essentially doing forfeiture like this since the 1920s during Prohibition. So it's something that is very traditional in terms of policing. So they could allow them to continue doing it. Where the public issue came from was actually this really interesting coalition of strange bedfellows, because a lot of these people were civil libertarians. Some of them were progressive prosecutors and other people in the legal world, and then anti-police brutality activists and the like. They kind of came together in the late 1990s and formed this coalition where they got the attention of Congress and various state governments to reform it, basically, to rethink the expansion of civil forfeiture and to consider reforms. And eventually they succeeded in a very moderate reform. I think it was 2000 or 2002, that basically just kind of limited some parts of forfeiture. It added more regulation. It required the people whose property that was being forfeited, it required them to have more information about what they could do to stop the forfeiture and all that stuff. But ultimately, since then, there hasn't really been much of an effort to reform forfeiture. There were efforts during the Obama administration. Attorney General Eric Holder did end, I don't remember it's entirely forfeiture or just civil forfeiture or an aspect of forfeiture. That was brought back during the Trump administration. And since then, there have been a couple of Supreme Court cases, but there's been no real movement towards actually reforming what is still very powerful and pervasive tool of law enforcement. And I think that if as I continue to do more and more research, I think where I'm looking at in particular is how state governments begin to treat forfeiture, because while forfeiture was expanded at the federal level, that sort of expansion provided justification for state governments to expand it. And within those state governments, there was a lot more movement in terms of reform. So how much of a public issue it was, it certainly was, but it really didn't pick up steam until a decade or so after it was expanded. And in terms of, was it something Detroiters contested, approved of, it's still kind of difficult to ascertain that, because part of the problem is the people that are being criminalized, the people whose stuff are being forfeited, there's not much that they produce, and there's not much testimony or statements that they have. Unfortunately, I'm unable to access kind of the full range of court records. A lot of this project uses court records that I've been using and finding in the archive. I don't have their testimonies. I don't have all the other material. And part of that is that, they didn't go through trials. It was a civil suit. And most of the time, they weren't actually aware that their property was being forfeited in this way, because they would have addresses, but addresses would be the wrong addresses. Some of them didn't have consistent places to live. So it's really unclear what the people whose property was being forfeited, how they thought about it. But in terms of Detroiters in general, there was a very large movement in the city that advocated for stuff like forfeiture, because they saw it, and particularly these anti-crime groups that I mentioned, Just the Neighbors, these sort of ad hoc organizations, these block clubs, crime victim rights associations, and the like. They were really supportive and approving of forfeiture, because they saw it as a way to directly get rid of what they saw as a problem in their neighborhood, notably the drug trade and the effects of that on the community. So they were supportive of it, but there were a lot of concerns, and I read this in a lot of op-eds, a lot of concerns by these activists too about overreach. How far is this going? And not just about overreach, but also about where's the money going? Because one of the ways they advertised this forfeiture practice in the city was that the city would forfeit property and they would give it back to the communities. So, for example, Gladys Fiju's house, the way it was broadcasted, because this was a very important and very highly reported instance of forfeiture, the police were basically like, look, we're going to seize this house and we're going to give it back to the community, and the community can set up a center, or maybe they could set up affordable housing or something along those lines. But it was very unclear, to what extent all the properties are seized actually translated into that. I found in the archives a lot of grants that were given to churches and different community organizations, but in terms of the total amount of money and assets they seize, it's not equal. So it's really unclear that people's approval reflected the reality of the situation that was happening there. But really, really interesting questions. Thank you.
And it becomes very, very a class fight too, because
Yes.
the situation that you described in your first slide, this family had to resort to doing something that perhaps they would not have even considered 10 years before, but because of the circumstances. I also had, maybe want us to pull back a little bit, because obviously what we have been hearing a lot about is this war on drugs that has, contributed to the carceral state. And the people who are in our audience today, most of them have read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and she concentrates a lot on the war on drugs. And I'm not sure if you feel comfortable telling us, just in the context of your own research, has the war on drugs been a success or a failure, and why or why not, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the key sort of policy question I ask myself all the time, and I'm actually teaching a course on the war on drugs in the upcoming semester. So it's a question I'm going to have my students ask. Was it a failure? A lot of ways like in terms of a policy sense, like we think about the war on drugs as we take people's word for it, I guess, these policymakers as that are doing this in order to stop the drug crisis, which there was a crisis of addiction and a crisis of illicit economies in cities around the country. Did it successfully respond to that? And the answer is no, that it was ultimately a failure. And in fact, it wasn't just a failure, but it actually made things far worse. And it made things far worse in a variety of ways. I mentioned a little bit about how it made drug trafficking more violent by disrupting these illicit economies, which in turn created violence as disputes occurred between various organizations that attempted to control territory and profits within the drug economy, but also around the world too, thinking a lot about the way the war on drugs has made places like the U.S. border between Mexico and the United States more violent, but also in places like Colombia, Bolivia, where the original ingredients for these drugs were coming from too, and the way it made these places very dangerous. So in terms of solving this problem of drug addiction in the United States, it was a total failure. And I think that one of the things we can point at today and acknowledge the sort of hypocriticalness of the war on drugs is that we currently have a massive opioid crisis, which is being treated and framed much differently. And it's being treated and framed as a public health issue. Not all over the place, but for the most part. And the people who are addicted to opioids are framed as victims of this. Whereas the people who are addicted to crack cocaine, heroin, variety of these other drugs that are so racialized and are so associated with particular groups of people and places, they were described as almost enemies, violent actors, aberrational, not worthy of the kind of respect and services that we often cast upon people who are addicted during our contemporary opioid crisis. So in terms of it being a failure or a success, I like to think about it as more of sort of the this sort of process of carcerality, kind of this long process of the fact that, post 1950s, 1960s in the United States, we had this massive problem of deindustrialization that we really never contended with. That capitalism, our economy, our society was changing as a whole, and these changes were having major impacts on particularly cities, but really all over the country. And one of the effects of these changes is massive and persistent unemployment, underemployment, and for a lot of people, long-term underemployment. And when you're unemployed and you're suffering these crises and these structural issues, you turn to other means of making a living, of surviving, but also a means of acquiring respect too. There's a really fantastic book that's kind of an ethnography of crack houses. It's called In Search of Respect. And it's all about the sort of cultural elements of crack and the crack economy. And, I asked this question where it's like, like the money part about it is, of course, the driving factor of why people participate in illegal economies. But there's also the aspect of people want respect. And there's kind of this respect, this sort of machismo that's associated with drug dealing in a way that's very different from other forms of employment. So I find in my research all the time, as I'm trying to find documents produced by, or at least that document people who participate in these economies, why are they in it? What are they doing? How do they think about it? That's one of the big things that I find. It's not just about the money, it's about the respect too. So, the fact that we don't deal, in terms of criminal policy, we don't typically deal with this stuff that way, has a lot to do with this massive failure and the compounded inequalities the war on drugs has produced.
Would you say that some of those...
I'm sorry, Matt, go ahead.
Okay. Would you say that some of those inequalities really go all the way back to the way the war on drugs was launched? Because, it came out of the Nixon administration in '68 when he moved marijuana and heroin to Schedule I, and purposely used marijuana and heroin to, in his words, to target hippies and the Black Panthers. So, it was already racialized, and there was already a class element that we've just seen perpetuated with each subsequent policy.
Yeah, that's a really good question, George. And yeah, I would agree. I would frame 68. I'm glad you bring that up because that is a pivotal period and turning point. But I would actually push it back a bit further and say that we see this racialization occur very early on. Actually, in New York City is a really terrific article. I forget the name of it. I think it's in the Journal of Gilded Age and Progressive Age History. But there's a really amazing article about those are the first anti-narcotics laws passed in New York City in the 1920s, and it was directly responding to the fact that the Great Migration was occurring. Masses of formerly Black sharecroppers and tenants and other workers coming to these northern cities, and in particular coming at a time when narcotics of all sorts were being spread around the city, and very similar to cities in the 70s, 80s, underemployment, a lack of opportunity, and all this other stuff. These anti-narcotic laws were directly related to policymakers, law enforcement, and wealthy middle-class whites basically associating drug use with transgressions within the sort of formal and informal racial divide that's in New York, which of course is not a Jim Crow city, but contain many of the same sort of Jim Crow restrictions, all of it just not within the law. So we actually see this racialization occur a lot earlier, but I think you're definitely right in terms of the way the war on drugs was also a response to political and social movements. The fact that, in the 60s, and I'm thinking about everyone from, the spread of, hippies, but also like Timothy Leary and LSD, and drugs in the counterculture, the way the counterculture and these political formations that are emerging out of it, and the usage of drugs were kind of seen as dangers to the state, as a threat to the legitimacy of the state, and the desire to use that as a way to clamp down and fight against these organizations. So yeah, I definitely see that as a big part of the war on drugs.
Well, I guess this is our time to let you go. To our audience, you don't know, but Kenneth has to catch a train And so we're going to reluctantly let him go because this has been fascinating, Kenneth. And when is your graduation? What's your target?
I still have 2 years, so
2 years,
May
okay.
2025. That's the hope. Yeah.
So if we're still around, we're going to hold you to coming back and letting us know about your job search, but also, the rest of your research, because it really is fascinating. And I think our students and staff and faculty have really benefited from your expertise. So we will see you in a couple of years, young man.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
You're welcome. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.